The wind howled across the Nevada desert like a banshee warning of something terrible to come. Lieutenant Colonel Myra "Ghost" Thorne stepped out of the black SUV, her boots hitting the scorched earth with a hollow thud that seemed to echo across the endless wasteland. Behind her, three generals in pressed uniforms exchanged glances that spoke volumes, the kind of looks reserved for watching someone walk toward their own execution. The shooting range stretched before them like a graveyard of shattered dreams. 12 targets, each positioned at impossible distances, each designed to humble even the most elite marksmen. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, creating heat mirages that danced between the firing position and the furthest target, a steel silhouette barely visible at 2,800 meters. No human being had ever achieved a perfect score on this range. Not Delta Force operators, not Navy SEALs, not Marine Scout snipers who could thread a needle at 1,000 yards. General Harrison cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the desert silence like a blade. "Colonel Thorne," he began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional skepticism, "this isn't a publicity stunt. This range has broken men who have spent their entire careers behind a scope. The atmospheric conditions alone make it nearly impossible. Wind shear, temperature gradients, elevation changes that would confuse a computer." Myra's green eyes remained fixed on the distant targets, calculating angles and wind patterns with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to trust mathematics over emotions. The scar running from her left temple to her jaw caught the harsh sunlight, a souvenir from a night mission over Syria that had ended with her F-16 cartwheeling through enemy airspace before she'd somehow managed to nurse it home on one engine and pure willpower. "Nearly impossible," General Rodriguez added, stepping forward with the swagger of a man who had never been proven wrong. "The longest confirmed shot in modern warfare was 3,540 meters, but that was under perfect conditions, with a spotter and multiple attempts. This range demands perfection on the first try, at distances that push the absolute limits of ballistics." The fourth man present, a civilian contractor whose expensive suit looked absurdly out of place in the desert, checked his watch with obvious impatience. "Gentlemen, the demonstration was scheduled for 1400 hours. The Secretary of Defense is waiting for our report." General Chen stepped closer to Myra, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a confidential whisper. "Colonel, no one expects you to succeed here. This is about proving a point regarding realistic expectations for integrated combat units. Sometimes the best way to serve your country is to acknowledge limitations." Myra finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable as carved stone. "General," she said quietly, "you're absolutely right about one thing. This is about proving a point." The distant targets seemed to shimmer in the heat like ghostly sentinels, waiting to judge whether legends were born or buried in the unforgiving mathematics of trajectory and wind. The weapons locker stood open like a mouth full of steel teeth, each rifle representing decades of engineering evolution designed to push projectiles beyond the horizon. Myra moved through the selection with the casual expertise of someone who understood that guns were merely tools, extensions of human will translated into physics. Her fingers traced the stock of a Barrett, then moved to the sleeker lines of a Che-Tak M200 intervention, finally settling on something that made the observing generals exchange puzzled glances. "That's a standard M24 SWS," General Harrison observed, unable to keep the condescension from his voice. "Colonel, this isn't a training exercise. The targets begin at 1,500 meters and extend to nearly 3,000. You'll need every advantage modern ballistics can provide." Myra hefted the rifle with practiced ease, her movements economical and precise. The M24 sniper weapon system had been her companion through 3 combat deployments, its weight and balance as familiar as her own heartbeat. Where others saw limitation, she saw reliability. "Sometimes, General, the best advantage is knowing your equipment so well that it becomes part of you." The civilian contractor consulted his tablet, stylus clicking against the screen with nervous energy. The scoring system is binary, hit or miss. No points for proximity. The atmospheric computer shows variable crosswinds at altitude, with gusts reaching 22 knots. The temperature differential between ground level and the target zones creates significant thermal layers that will affect bullet trajectory. General Rodriguez positioned himself behind the spotting scope, his movement suggesting this was more theater than genuine assistance. The first target is at 1,500 meters, standard military silhouette, but positioned on uneven terrain that creates partial defilade. Wind is quartering from the southeast at approximately 15 knots, with periodic gusts that spike the measurement. Myra settled into her firing position with the fluid grace of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. Her body molded to the earth as if she were becoming part of the landscape itself. The rifle's bipod legs bit into the sandy soil, creating a stable platform that would absorb recoil and maintain sight picture through the follow-through. "Call sign Ghost," General Chen muttered to his aide, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Appropriate, considering her chances of hitting anything at these distances are about as real as supernatural phenomena. The spotting scope revealed the first target through waves of heat distortion, a black silhouette that seemed to dance and waver like a mirage. The wind indicators showed consistent patterns, but Myra knew that surface conditions rarely told the complete story. At extreme distances, projectiles traveled through multiple atmospheric layers, each with its own personality of pressure, temperature, and humidity. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat, the expansion and contraction of her lungs, the subtle vibrations in the earth beneath her body. Somewhere in the desert silence, a hawk cried out, a sound that seemed to stretch across vast distances before fading into nothingness. When she opened her eyes, the crosshairs settled on the target with mechanical precision, and the world contracted to a single point of absolute focus. The M24's trigger broke cleanly at 3.5 pounds of pressure, the rifle's report echoing across the desert like distant thunder. Through the scope, Myra watched the vapor trail of her bullet arc across the burning sky, an invisible line connecting her position to a target that seemed impossibly far away. The projectile's flight time at this distance meant nearly 2 seconds of suspense, an eternity in the compressed timeframe of precision shooting. "Hit," General Rodriguez announced from behind the spotting scope, his voice carrying a note of surprise that he tried unsuccessfully to suppress. "Center mass. Clean impact on target 1. The civilian contractor made a notation on his tablet, stylus movements sharp and mechanical. Target 1 confirmed. Range 1,520 meters, accounting for elevation variance. Proceeding to Target 2. Target 2 materialized through the heat shimmer at 1,800 meters, a steel plate positioned behind a natural depression that created challenging sight lines. The wind had shifted slightly, now coming from the southwest with irregular gusts that made the distant mirage patterns dance like water. Myra adjusted her position minutely, feeling the stock settle into the hollow of her shoulder with familiar comfort. General Harrison moved closer to observe her shooting technique, his professional curiosity beginning to override his initial skepticism. The wind rose significantly between shots. At this distance, a 5-knot variance can push around 18 inches off target. Myra's breathing settled into the familiar rhythm of precision shooting. Inhale, partial exhale, natural respiratory pause, trigger press. Her body became a biological shooting platform, every muscle group working in harmony to create the stability necessary for extreme distance accuracy. The crosshairs settled on the target's center, tracking smoothly through the natural movement of her respiratory cycle. "Conditions are deteriorating," General Chen observed, consulting his handheld anemometer. "Wind speed is increasing, and the thermal layers are becoming more pronounced. The afternoon heat is creating significant atmospheric disturbance." The second shot broke with the same mechanical precision as the first, the rifle's recoil absorbed by Myra's positioning and technique. Through the scope, she tracked the bullet's invisible path across the shimmering desert, her mind automatically calculating the complex variables of external ballistics: wind drift, gravitational drop, atmospheric pressure, temperature effects on powder burn rate. "Hit," Rodriguez called out, his tone now carrying genuine respect rather than surprised acknowledgement. "Dead center on target 2. That's 2 for 2 at distances that would challenge most military marksmen." The third target waited at 2,100 meters, positioned at the edge of visual acquisition even through high magnification optics. At this distance, the target appeared as little more than a dark smudge against the desert backdrop, its exact dimensions lost in the atmospheric distortion created by the rising heat. The wind indicators showed increasingly complex patterns, surface winds differing significantly from mid-level atmospheric conditions. Myra made minute adjustments to her scope's elevation turret, each click representing a precise mathematical relationship between distance, gravity, and projectile velocity. The numbers told a story of physics pushed to its absolute limits, where the smallest miscalculation would send a bullet into empty air. The hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the vastness like a reminder that some things transcended human ambition. General Harrison stepped back from the spotting scope, wiping perspiration from his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. The desert heat was becoming oppressive, but something else was causing the moisture on his brow, the slow realization that they might be witnessing something unprecedented. "Colonel Thorne," he said carefully, "you're aware that no one has ever achieved more than 7 hits on this particular range configuration." Myra's response came without breaking her concentration on the distant target. "With respect, General, no one is a very specific category. It doesn't necessarily include everyone who might attempt this course." The civilian contractor looked up from his tablet, digital stylus hovering over the screen like a surgical instrument. "The atmospheric modeling software indicates that conditions are approaching the threshold where accurate fire becomes statistically improbable. Wind shear between surface level and projectile apex is creating trajectory variance that exceeds compensatory capability." General Rodriguez remained focused through the spotting scope, professional fascination evident in his posture. "Target 3 is partially obscured by terrain features. The shooting angle creates a complex geometric problem that requires compensation for both elevation change and the Earth's curvature at this distance." The third shot's preparation took longer than the previous 2. Myra's breathing cycle extended as she worked through the ballistic calculations that separated precision from hope. The wind had developed a rhythmic pattern, gusting hard for several seconds, then dropping to almost nothing before building again. Timing the shot to coincide with the wind lull required patience that most shooters lacked. Through her scope, the target seemed to pulse with the heat waves rising from the desert floor. The crosshairs moved in microscopic increments as she tracked through her natural tremor, waiting for that perfect moment when human physiology, atmospheric conditions, and mechanical precision aligned into a single point of possibility. The rifle fired, its report swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert. The bullet's flight seemed to last forever, a speck of metal carrying human intent across an impossible distance, subject to forces that could deflect it by feet or inches depending on variables too complex for conscious calculation. "Hit," Rodriguez announced, his voice now carrying unmistakable awe. 3 for 3. Colonel, that was a remarkable piece of shooting." General Chen consulted his range finder, shaking his head slowly. 2,127 meters. That shot would be noteworthy under any circumstances, but in these conditions. He let the sentence hang unfinished, implications settling over the group like dust. The fourth target materialized at the edge of human visual capability, 400 meters distant, positioned behind a rise that created additional complexity for bullet trajectory calculation. At this range, atmospheric effects became the dominant factor in accuracy, with temperature layers, humidity gradients, and wind shear creating a three-dimensional maze that projectiles had to navigate successfully. Myra made significant adjustments to her scope, elevation clicks mounting as she compensated for the extreme distance. The mathematical relationship between her position and the target involved calculations that pushed beyond standard ballistic tables into territory where experience and intuition became as important as technical knowledge. The desert silence seemed to deepen around them, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the scrub brush and the distant cry of the circling hawk. The fourth shot required a full minute of preparation, as Myra waited for atmospheric conditions to stabilize. Wind patterns at extreme distance became increasingly unpredictable, with surface conditions often bearing little relationship to the air currents that would actually affect bullet flight. She watched dust devils form and dissipate in the middle distance, each one a visible indicator of the complex air movements that could spell the difference between hit and miss. Conditions are becoming increasingly challenging, the civilian contractor observed, consulting multiple digital displays. Atmospheric pressure is dropping, and wind variance is approaching the maximum compensatory range for most ballistic computer systems. General Harrison positioned himself where he could observe both Myra's technique and the target area through binoculars. "Colonel, at this distance, we're approaching the absolute limits of what's considered possible with conventional ammunition. The bullet drop alone exceeds 40 feet, and wind drift can vary by several feet depending on atmospheric layers." The shot broke with the same mechanical precision that had characterized the previous 3 attempts. Through her scope, Myra tracked the bullet's invisible path across heat waves that made the desert air seem liquid. At maximum distance, projectile flight time extended beyond 3 seconds, an eternity during which atmospheric conditions could change dramatically. "Hit," Rodriguez called out, his voice now carrying a note of disbelief. "4 for 4, that's unprecedented on this range." General Chen lowered his binoculars, expression troubled. "Colonel Thorne, this performance is exceptional doesn't begin to cover it. Are you certain you haven't practiced on this specific range configuration before?" Myra's green eyes remained fixed on the distant targets, her voice steady and professional. "General, I've never been to this facility before today, but I have been shooting at extreme distances for the better part of 15 years, in conditions ranging from Arctic cold to desert heat, from sea level to high altitude. Physics doesn't change based on location." The fifth target waited at 2,650 meters, a distance that pushed into territory where only the most sophisticated military sniper systems were considered viable. The target appeared as little more than a suggestion through the heat shimmer, its exact outline lost in atmospheric distortion that made precise aiming as much art as science. The wind had developed a complex pattern of gusts and lulls that seemed to follow no discernible rhythm. Surface indicators showed one set of conditions, while the barely visible movement of dust at middle distances suggested entirely different air currents aloft. Myra studied these patterns with the patience of someone who understood that rushing extreme distance shots was a guaranteed path to failure. Her scope adjustments became more deliberate, each click of the elevation turret representing careful calculation of factors that extended far beyond simple ballistic tables. At these distances, the Earth's rotation began to influence bullet trajectory, a phenomenon called the Coriolis effect that most shooters never encountered in practical shooting situations. The preparation time extended as atmospheric conditions continued to deteriorate, heat waves rising from the desert floor in patterns that made target acquisition increasingly difficult through high magnification optics. The fifth shot seemed to hang in the air longer than physically possible, suspended in the shimmering heat like a promise that might or might not be kept. The report of the rifle was immediately swallowed by the desert's vast silence, leaving only the whisper of wind and the distant cry of hunting hawks to mark the passage of time. "Hit," General Rodriguez announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "5 consecutive hits at distances that. This isn't supposed to be possible." The civilian contractor's stylus had stopped moving across his tablet screen. He stared at the device as if the numbers displayed there might change if he looked hard enough. "We're witnessing performance that exceeds every established baseline for human marksmanship capability. This data will require extensive verification before any official report can be filed." General Harrison walked closer to Myra's firing position, studying her technique with the intensity of someone trying to decode a mystery. "Colonel, your breathing rhythm, your trigger control, your positioning, everything appears textbook standard. But the results are anything but standard. How do you account for this level of accuracy?" Myra shifted slightly behind her rifle, maintaining her sight picture on the 6th target while answering. "General, precision shooting at extreme distance isn't about having superhuman abilities. It's about understanding that every shot is a conversation between physics and preparation. You listen to what the environment is telling you, and you respond with the appropriate technical adjustments." Target 6 materialized through the scope at 2,800 meters, approaching the absolute maximum effective range for the ammunition and rifle combination she was using. At this distance, the target was barely visible even through maximum magnification, appearing as little more than a dark spot that flickered in and out of definition through the atmospheric turbulence. The mathematical calculations required for this shot pushed beyond standard ballistic solutions into territory where environmental factors became the primary variables. Wind speed and direction at multiple altitude levels, temperature gradients that affected air density, humidity levels that influenced drag coefficients, each factor requiring compensation that accumulated into adjustments measured in multiple feet rather than inches. General Chen consulted multiple measuring devices, shaking his head slowly. Wind variance at altitude is exceeding measurement capability. We're seeing thermal layers that create deflection zones impossible to calculate accurately with conventional methods. The 6 shots preparation became an exercise in patience that tested even Myra's considerable discipline. Wind patterns cycled through phases of relative calm followed by gusts that would make accurate shooting impossible. She waded through multiple cycles, breathing steadily, crosshairs tracking the barely visible target through natural tremor and atmospheric distortion. When the shot finally broke, the rifle's report seemed anticlimactic compared to the tension that had built during the extended preparation. The bullet disappeared into heat waves that made the air itself seem unreliable, carrying human intention across a distance that pushed the absolute boundaries of what physics would allow. "Hit," Rodriguez whispered, lowering the spotting scope with hands that weren't entirely steady. "6 for 6. I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of military service." The 7th target marked the beginning of what range designers had privately referred to as the impossible zone, distances where atmospheric effects dominated bullet trajectory, to such an extent that successful hits became matters of statistical probability rather than skill. At 2,950 meters, Target 7 existed at the very edge of visual acquisition, a ghost-like presence that seemed to fade in and out of existence through the desert's heat shimmer. Myra's scope adjustments had reached their mechanical limits. Elevation turret nearly topped out as she compensated for bullet drop that exceeded 50 feet at this distance. The wind indicators showed increasingly chaotic patterns, with surface conditions bearing no relationship to the air currents that would actually influence her bullet's 3.5-second flight time to the target. "Colonel," General Harrison said quietly, "you've already achieved something remarkable. No one would question your abilities if you chose to conclude the demonstration at this point." For the first time since beginning the exercise, Myra looked away from her scope, meeting the general's eyes with an expression that seemed to contain depths of experience that extended far beyond this single moment in the desert. "General, with respect, I didn't come here to achieve something remarkable. I came here to complete a task." The civilian contractor had stopped taking notes entirely, his expensive tablet lying forgotten in the dust beside his polished shoes. The ballistic computer shows probability of hit at this distance as less than 15%, even under optimal conditions. Current atmospheric disturbance reduces that to single digits. General Rodriguez remained focused through the spotting scope, his professional fascination overriding any skepticism that had characterized his earlier attitude. The target is barely visible through atmospheric distortion. Wind indicators suggest multiple shear layers that would deflect a projectile by several feet in any direction. The seventh shot's preparation extended beyond 10 minutes as Myra waited for atmospheric conditions to reach something approaching stability. The desert heat had created thermal columns that rose like invisible pillars, each one capable of deflecting a bullet by significant distances. She studied these patterns with the patience of someone who understood that extreme-distance precision shooting was as much about environmental awareness as technical skill. When atmospheric conditions finally aligned into something that might be called favorable, the shot broke with the same mechanical precision that had characterized the previous 6 attempts. The bullet's flight across nearly 3,000 meters of disturbed air seemed to defy probability, carrying human will across a distance where success required a convergence of skill, preparation, and factors beyond conscious control. "Hit," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying overtones of something that might have been reverence. 7 consecutive hits at distances that exceed established performance parameters by significant margins. General Chen removed his uniform hat, running fingers through graying hair that showed the stress of witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human capability. "Colonel Thorne, this performance is going to require extensive documentation and verification. The implications for military doctrine regarding precision fire capabilities are substantial." The 8th target waited at 3,100 meters, a distance that placed it beyond the effective range of most military sniper systems, and deep into territory where atmospheric effects made accurate fire more theoretical than practical. Through maximum magnification, the target flickered between visibility and complete obscuration, as heat waves created optical illusions that made distance estimation increasingly difficult. The desert silence had taken on an almost oppressive quality, broken only by the whisper of wind through sparse vegetation, and the occasional cry of hunting birds that seemed to mock human ambition with their effortless mastery of the air currents that made precision shooting so challenging. Target 8 represented a mathematical challenge that pushed beyond conventional ballistic solutions into territory where environmental factors created variables too complex for standard calculation methods. The bullet drop at this distance exceeded 60 feet, requiring elevation adjustments that approached the mechanical limits of her scope's adjustment range. Wind compensation required estimates of air current behavior at multiple altitudes, each calculation subject to margins of error that accumulated into potential missed distances measured in yards rather than inches. Myra's preparation time extended as she studied wind patterns that seemed to change character every few minutes. Dust devils formed and dissipated in the middle distance, each one a visible indicator of atmospheric turbulence that could spell disaster for extreme distance accuracy. The wind indicators on her position showed one set of conditions, while the barely perceptible movement of heat shimmer suggested entirely different air currents at the target location. "The atmospheric modeling software has stopped providing meaningful data," the civilian contractor announced, staring at his tablet screen with obvious frustration. "At this distance, environmental variables exceed the compensatory capability of conventional ballistic calculation systems." General Harrison positioned himself where he could observe both Myra's shooting technique and the target area through high-power binoculars. "Colonel, we're approaching distances where successful hits become matters of statistical probability rather than skill. The convergence of factors required for accuracy at this range occurs rarely enough that most systems don't even attempt engagement." The eighth shot required nearly 15 minutes of preparation as atmospheric conditions cycled through patterns of relative stability, followed by periods of significant turbulence. Myra waited with the patience of someone who understood that rushing extreme-distance shots guaranteed failure, her breathing rhythm steady and controlled as she tracked the barely visible target through natural tremor and optical distortion. When conditions finally approached something that might be considered favorable, the shot broke with mechanical precision that seemed almost supernatural given the complexity of variables involved. The bullet's 4-second flight time across disturbed air represented a convergence of skill, preparation, and factors beyond human control that made success seem miraculous rather than probable. "Hit," General Rodriguez whispered, his voice carrying overtones of disbelief that he no longer attempted to suppress. "8 for 8 at distances that challenge everything we thought we knew about precision fire capabilities." The ninth target materialized at 3,250 meters through heat shimmer that made it appear more like a mirage than a physical object. At this distance, atmospheric effects dominated every aspect of bullet trajectory, creating challenges that pushed far beyond the realm of conventional marksmanship into territory, where success required an almost mystical understanding of environmental factors. The wind had developed patterns so complex that surface indicators provided virtually no useful information about conditions aloft. Thermal columns rose invisibly from the superheated desert floor, each one creating deflection zones that could send a bullet off course by distances measured in multiple feet. The target itself flickered between visibility and complete obscuration, as optical illusions created by extreme heat made distance estimation increasingly unreliable. General Chen walked closer to Myra's position, studying her technique with the intensity of someone trying to understand phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions. "Colonel, at this distance we're dealing with factors that extend beyond human compensation capability. The Earth's rotation creates deflection forces that most shooters never encounter. Temperature gradients affect air density in ways that change bullet trajectory by unpredictable amounts." Myra's scope adjustments had reached absolute mechanical limits. Elevation turret topped out as she compensated for bullet drop that exceeded 70 feet at this extreme distance. Her calculations now relied as much on experience and intuition as mathematical precision, environmental awareness becoming more important than ballistic tables in determining shot placement. "The probability mathematics don't support continued success at these distances," the civilian contractor observed, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious bewilderment. "We're witnessing performance that exists outside established parameters for human marksmanship capability." The ninth shot's preparation became an exercise in environmental patience that extended beyond 20 minutes. Wind patterns showed no consistency, changing direction and intensity in cycles that seemed to follow no discernible logic. Myra studied these patterns with the dedication of someone who understood that extreme-distance precision shooting required reading atmospheric conditions like a complex language where mistranslation meant failure. Dust movements at various distances provided clues about air current behavior at different altitudes, each observation adding to a mental map of atmospheric conditions that would influence her bullet's extended flight time. The shot would require perfect timing to coincide with a brief moment of relative atmospheric stability, a window that might last only seconds between periods of significant turbulence. When that moment finally arrived, the shot broke with the same mechanical precision that had characterized the previous 8 attempts, despite conditions that made success seem virtually impossible. The bullet disappeared into heat waves that transformed the air itself into a maze of optical illusion and atmospheric disturbance. "Hit," Rodriguez announced, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. 9 consecutive hits at distances that. This performance exists outside every established baseline for human capability. Target 10 waited at 3,400 meters, a distance so extreme that it pushed beyond the effective range of most modern military sniper systems and deep into theoretical territory, where atmospheric physics became the dominant factor in projectile behavior. Through her scope, the target appeared as little more than a suggestion, flickering between states of visibility like something that might not actually exist. The desert heat had reached levels that created optical conditions resembling liquid rather than air. Heat waves rose in patterns so intense that they distorted not just visual perception, but the physical properties of the atmosphere through which her bullets had to travel. Temperature differentials between ground level and altitude created density layers that could deflect projectiles by distances measured in multiple yards. General Harrison removed his uniform jacket, perspiration staining his shirt despite the relative protection of the observation area. "Colonel Thorne, you've already demonstrated capabilities that will require us to reassess fundamental assumptions about precision fire doctrine. This performance level exists outside every established parameter we use for planning and training." The mathematical challenges posed by Target 10 pushed far beyond conventional ballistic solutions into territory where environmental factors created variables too numerous and complex for human calculation. Bullet drop at this distance exceeded 80 feet, requiring elevation compensation that had exhausted her scope's adjustment range. Wind compensation required estimates of air behavior across multiple altitude layers, each subject to margins of error that could accumulate into missed distances measured in tens of feet. Myra's preparation routine had evolved into something resembling meditation as much as technical preparation. She studied atmospheric patterns with the patience of someone who understood that extreme distance shooting required harmony between human intention and environmental reality. Wind indicators provided minimal useful information at these distances, forcing reliance on subtle visual cues that most people couldn't even perceive. "The atmospheric conditions are beyond measurement capability," the civilian contractor announced, his sophisticated equipment rendered essentially useless by the extreme nature of the challenge. Temperature gradients, wind shear, and optical distortion have created shooting conditions that exist outside the parameters of conventional ballistic science. The 10th shot required preparation time that extended beyond 30 minutes as Myra waited for atmospheric conditions to reach something approaching stability. The heat had created thermal columns so intense that they were visible as distortions in the air itself, each one representing a deflection zone that could render accuracy impossible. She waited through multiple cycles of relative calm, followed by periods of significant atmospheric turbulence. When the moment finally arrived, a brief window of relative stability in the atmospheric chaos, the shot broke with precision that seemed to transcend the physical limitations of equipment and environment. The bullet's flight across more than 2 miles of disturbed air represented a convergence of factors so improbable that success seemed to challenge the fundamental laws of physics. "Hit," General Rodriguez whispered, his hands shaking slightly as he lowered the spotting scope. 10 consecutive hits at distances that. I don't have words for what we're witnessing here. The 11th target materialized at 3,550 meters through atmospheric conditions that made visual acquisition more theoretical than practical. At this extreme distance, the target existed at the very edge of human visual capability, appearing and disappearing through heat shimmer like something conjured from imagination, rather than positioned in physical reality. The mathematical challenges posed by this shot pushed beyond every established parameter for precision fire. General Chen consulted multiple measuring devices before shaking his head in obvious frustration. Wind variance has exceeded measurement capability. Temperature differentials are creating atmospheric layers that deflect projectiles by amounts that can't be calculated using conventional methods. We're dealing with shooting conditions that exist outside the realm of practical ballistics. The scope adjustments required for Target 11 had pushed far beyond manufacturer specifications, forcing Myra to employ techniques learned through years of extreme distance shooting experience. Elevation compensation for bullet drop that exceeded 90 feet required creative solutions that combined mechanical adjustment with holdover techniques that relied more on experience than mathematical precision. "Colonel," General Harrison said quietly, "this demonstration has already exceeded every possible expectation. The data we've gathered will revolutionize understanding of human marksmanship capability. There's no need to risk everything on shots that challenge the fundamental laws of physics." Myra's response came without breaking her concentration on the barely visible target. "General, the laws of physics don't change based on human expectations. They simply define the parameters within which success becomes possible." The preparation time for the 11th shot extended beyond 40 minutes as atmospheric conditions cycled through patterns of extreme instability. Heat waves had reached intensity levels that created optical illusions so severe that the target seemed to move independently of any atmospheric effects. Myra studied these patterns with dedication that bordered on obsession, understanding that success at this distance required perfect harmony between human skill and environmental conditions. Wind patterns had become so chaotic that surface indicators provided no useful information about conditions aloft. The shot would require perfect timing to coincide with a moment of atmospheric stability so brief that it might last only seconds, a window of opportunity that could close before human reflexes could respond. The bullet's flight time at this extreme distance would exceed 4.5 seconds, during which atmospheric conditions could change dramatically enough to render initial calculations meaningless. Success required not just perfect shot execution, but also the ability to predict environmental behavior across an extended time period. When that perfect moment finally arrived, a convergence of factors so improbable that it seemed orchestrated by forces beyond human understanding, the shot broke with mechanical precision that defied every logical assessment of possibility. The bullet disappeared into heat waves that had transformed the desert air into something resembling liquid fire. "Hit," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying overtones of something that might have been fear. 11 consecutive hits at distances that exist outside every established parameter for human capability. The 12th and final target waited at 3,700 meters, a distance so extreme that it challenged not just the limits of human marksmanship, but the fundamental capabilities of the rifle and ammunition system itself. Through maximum magnification, the target was barely distinguishable from the heat shimmer that surrounded it, appearing more like a trick of optical illusion than a physical object positioned in measurable space. The civilian contractor had abandoned his sophisticated measuring equipment entirely, staring across the desert with the expression of someone witnessing phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. At this distance, we're dealing with projectile flight times that exceed 5 seconds. Atmospheric conditions can change dramatically during bullet flight, rendering initial calculations meaningless. General Harrison walked closer to Myra's position, his professional composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of witnessing performance that existed outside every established baseline for human capability. "Colonel Thorne, you've already achieved something that will require us to completely reassess military doctrine regarding precision fire capabilities. This final shot, the variables involved push beyond anything that could be considered reasonable. The mathematical challenges posed by Target 12 existed in territory where conventional ballistic science became inadequate for describing projectile behavior. Bullet drop at this extreme distance exceeded 100 feet, requiring compensation techniques that pushed far beyond standard scope adjustment ranges. Wind effects accumulated across multiple atmospheric layers could deflect a projectile by distances measured in tens of yards, creating margins of error that made accuracy seem virtually impossible. Myra's preparation routine had evolved into something resembling a ritual, as she studied atmospheric patterns with the intensity of someone reading a complex text in a foreign language. Heat waves rose from the desert floor in columns so intense that they were visible as distortions in the air itself, each one representing a deflection zone that could render precision shooting impossible. The wind indicators had become essentially meaningless at this distance, forcing reliance on subtle environmental cues that existed at the edge of human perception. Dust movements at various distances provided hints about air current behavior, but the relationship between surface conditions and atmospheric effects aloft had become so complex that interpretation required experience that few humans possessed. General Rodriguez remained focused through the spotting scope despite atmospheric conditions that made target acquisition increasingly theoretical. The target is barely visible through heat distortion. Optical effects are creating illusions that make distance estimation unreliable. We're dealing with shooting conditions that challenge the fundamental capabilities of human vision. The 12th shot's preparation extended beyond an hour, as Myra waited for atmospheric conditions to reach something that might be called stable. The desert heat had created thermal effects so intense that they seemed to alter the physical properties of the air itself, transforming the atmosphere into something that resembled liquid rather than gas. When the moment finally arrived, a brief convergence of atmospheric factors so improbable that it seemed to challenge the laws of probability, the shot broke with precision that transcended every logical assessment of human limitation. The bullet disappeared into heat waves that had transformed the desert into something resembling an alien landscape, where normal rules of physics seemed suspended. The silence that followed stretched across the desert like a held breath, broken only by the whisper of wind and the distant cry of hunting hawks that seemed to mock human ambition with their effortless mastery of atmospheric currents. "Hit," General Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. 12 for 12. Perfect score at distances that. This isn't supposed to be humanly possible. The desert silence that followed seemed deeper than the vacuum of space itself, as if the entire landscape was struggling to process what had just occurred. General Harrison stood motionless, his binoculars hanging forgotten around his neck, staring across the heat shimmer toward targets that had just witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human capability. The civilian contractor's expensive tablet lay abandoned in the dust, its sophisticated sensors and ballistic computers rendered irrelevant by performance that existed outside every established parameter. He walked in small circles, shaking his head repeatedly, muttering calculations under his breath that refused to add up to anything resembling logical explanation. 12 consecutive hits, General Rodriguez repeated, his voice carrying the tone of someone reporting something he didn't.